All right, guys, you guys ready to get started? Let me filter in. Yep. All right, well, welcome to the Endowment Charter proposal. As we not only got this group here, we're also streaming online for anybody who wants to watch this this weekend, or we'll also send it out in our newsletter so people can watch the presentation and also listen to your guys' questions. As you guys, please feel free to ask questions anytime. I'll try to repeat your questions into the mic for the guys online to hear what we're talking about. So my name is Mark Gepner. I'm on the endowment committee, and this is kind of an overview of kind of what we're proposing some changes to our endowment charter. All right, Jewel. So kind of what we'll walk through today is we'll kind of go back over a quick review of what is the endowment. We'll go through why do we want to make some changes to it, what are those changes, and then hopefully a fair amount of time at the end just for some quick question and answer and just open discussions to hear any of your guys' concerns. So what is the endowment? So let's jump into that. So first we'll talk about the history of the endowment. We can go to the next slide, Joel. So the endowment was established in 1989 by a group of our congregation, and its primary purpose was for the maintenance and support of our buildings and the properties that the United Methodists own. So that includes this church. We have a couple of houses that are adjacent to this, and then also the pastor's parsonage as well. So that's the primary purpose of the endowment, is to help maintain those buildings. And then it's also an endowed fund, and we'll use that word a lot. And basically what that means is the principal that was given to the endowment fund is not spendable, right? We invest that, we hold on to that, and we really only spend the growth off of that initial principal. So we'll use that word endowed a lot throughout this presentation. So it really has a very specific purpose, and it is an endowed fund. So those are the big two key takeaways from the history. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm an engineer at Garmin, and my general engineering rule is if I can't draw a picture of something, I don't understand it. So the guys at Garmin always make fun of me for all my little cartoons that I draw everywhere, but this is my attempt to explain the endowment. So I'm going to move up here and just kind of walk through this, and this isn't a very big picture, but it helps me understand the flow of how the endowment works. I haven't been on the endowment for very long, just starting at the beginning of 2022, and I didn't understand how it worked. So this was my attempt to kind of get my head wrapped around what is it, how do we operate with this endowment fund. So over on the left is a picture of a donor, someone from our congregation, and they provide gifts into the endowment fund. And in the blue circle is what we call our endowed assets. And those include loans, like the endowment holds a loan to Tonganoxie Methodist Church to support the 304 building. We also have CDs inside of our endowed assets, and we also own some property like the houses that I mentioned. So those are the kind of endowed assets that we use. When those assets grow or produce revenue, we can move that out through what we'll call a distribution checking account. So we pull it out of those accounts, and then for the most part, the primary spender of our endowed assets, or the growth of our endowed assets, is the board of trustees, right? They kind of come to us and say, we'd like to do this project or that project, and we'd like to spend this much money. So we take that money through that distribution checking account and write checks to the trustees. Up above with the blue piggy bank, that's really just the emergency fund. So as things grow, we kind of just push that growth into our emergency fund, and that's really where we pull a lot of money out for expenditures. Okay, so what are the current funds that we have today? So over on the right is our endowed, your left. And your left is our endowed assets. So those include the CDs, the loans, the property, some investments that we'll talk about later into our Kansas Methodist Foundation. And those total roughly $639,000. So there's a great gift. That's a great asset that we have as a church. And as we were researching this, we learned that we're really one of the only churches in the Tonganoxie area that have an endowment fund like this. So it really is a blessing for our congregation. I'm sorry, Jill, if we could go back. So the other assets that we have are the emergency fund that holds about $65,000 of really just pure spendable assets. And then to kind of just give you an understanding of what we've spent, in 2022 we spent about $30,000 on primarily all of the upgrades to the church today. And that is much, much higher than it traditionally is. We usually don't spend that much out of the endowment fund. Usually it's on the order of $2,000 to $3,000 a year. This year was a much bigger expenditure. Okay, let's go. So that covers the history. So now, why do we want to make changes to the endowment fund? So on our first slide there, Joel, the first and primary one we want to do, I apologize, you can't read these very well, that we want to expand our mission. So just like all the other committees that are at Tonganoxie United Methodist Church, we're walking through our mission statement, right? That we want to be a connecting, growing, and serving community. And as we met as the endowment committee, we want to say, how can we live that mission statement as well? So one of the things we thought we could do is we can grow and expand our mission of the people that we impact. Right now, really the only group that the endowment impacts is the Board of Trustees. So as we looked at, can we grow that? Can we make our impact broader than that? And we thought, yes, we think the answer to that is yes. And some of the things we'd like to be able to impact, in addition to the trustees, is the various groups around the church, whether that be children's committees, women's groups, whatever choir, whatever type of group that are inside of this building. We feel like we can have an impact on them. We feel like we can support mission trips and even other special projects, whatever the church may dream up into the future. And again, can also still continue to support the trustees. Okay, Joel. So another reason that we want to make changes to this is we want to try to shift our investment strategy. So when we think about the way that our investments are structured, we want to make sure that we are growing our investing, and how much that we spend after that growth, we're beating the rising cost of inflation, right? So when I think about, whenever I research investment guidelines or guidance, I always first start with Warren Buffett. He's kind of like the sensei. So he describes inflation as somebody trying to walk up a down escalator, right? You have to give more energy to overcome the downward momentum of the downward escalator. And that's really one of the challenges that we have today with our current investment mix, is it's very heavily based off of CDs. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But right now, with our CDs that don't make very much, on the order of 1% to 2%, they're really not overcoming the cost of inflation. So it doesn't leave us with very much or any spending that we can have based off that minimal amount of growth that we're getting in return. Okay, Jewel. So just to kind of hammer that home quickly, so this is just a quick overview of kind of what historical inflation rates have been. Our last 30 years in the U.S., it's roughly 2.33% is roughly what inflation has been. And our next slide kind of contrast that with some of our investments in CDs. We make approximately 2.33% historically on our CD-based returns, so almost flat. So on the next slide, we talked about how we want growth. Our growth minus our spending needs to overcome inflation. This kind of puts those numbers together. Our growth is roughly 2.36%. Inflation is 2.33%. So that leaves us with 0.03% in growth that we average on top of inflation. So today, with the amount of investments we have in CDs, that roughly equates to about $1,300 a year. Think back to what we spent this year, which was almost $30,000. What we're growing, what we're getting return on our investment isn't keeping pace with what we want to spend. So we can either change our investment strategies or try to grow the principal so that it makes more. So what we'd like to do, one of the steps we'd like to do, is change that investment strategy. And this is where we start to introduce the Kansas Methodist Foundation. And you guys met their president and CEO about a month ago when Dr. Dustin Petz came and spoke about estate planning and end-of-life planning, those type of things. He spoke one Sunday, and he's the president of this Methodist organization. And they offer a number of things, different investment vehicles, and we'll talk about exactly what they offer. But one of the things we like to use them as that that shift to a more diversified investment opportunity to help offset that cost of inflation and try to get more return on our investments. And they offer a number of different funds. They're like mutual funds. They have different asset mixes, whether it be domestic equity, international equity, or bonds and those types of things. These funds are very similar to any sort of index fund that you might have in your retirement fund. So we'll talk more about Kansas Methodist Foundation, but really think of them as that partner we're going to try to use as we look to change our investments out of primarily a CD-based one. We'll try to move to more of a equity-based type investment. And then finally, why do we want to make changes to the endowment is we want to increase the visibility of what the endowment is, what it does, how to connect to the endowment. I think some of the fear has been that this endowment has kind of been this black hole that nobody really understands. It doesn't know where the money comes from, doesn't know how the money is used, and we want to try to change that. And part of what we'll try to do is kind of threefold. The first thing we want to do is really try to educate the entire congregation on estate planning, like what Dustin Petz talked about. If you want to give to the endowment, how do you do that? Is it easy? Can I give you a pamphlet? When Matthew does end of life services, can he educate those families on how to give to the endowment if that's something they'd like to leave as a legacy of their family member? So part of it is just educating on how to give into the endowment. The next is really an opportunity for intentional spending, right? We don't want those gifts to just come into a black hole and they just stay there and grow, but they don't come out. So we want to intentionally spend, and we'll talk about that, but the idea is that we want to spend roughly 4% of our growth every single year intentionally, and we'll talk a little bit about how that's going to happen in a little bit later. But again, intentional spending is the takeaway there. And then lastly, after we spend that money, we want to tell the congregation about that impact. What did your giving do? How did we spend it? And then what impact did that have? So we'll try to talk about that in newsletters, on the websites, phone calls, but again, really try to go back to trying to thank the donors for it, number one, but then also expand that and educate the rest of the congregation on what this endowment fund is doing, and try to lift it out to be a much more public part of our church's life. Okay, so let's get down to specifics. What are the changes? So the first change that I have to cover is what is changing what's not changing, what's staying the same. So remember the very, very beginning, we talked about our endowment fund, how it had a very specific purpose, and it was an endowed fund. So when we think back about those original donors that gave to the endowment fund, we have to really consider their donors' intent. Really, they gave a large sum of money for a very specific reason, and we have to preserve that, right? We don't want to lose that gift's intent. So the big thing to take away from this is there will be a fund that has the exact same purpose as the existing endowment fund and is endowed, right? The first part of this is we're just really kind of changing and shifting where the money lives, but all of its purposes, all of its restrictions will continue to be the same way that they always were. The primary spender of that will be the Board of Trustees, so that part of it doesn't change at all, and we thought that was important to cover here because I think a lot of the congregation was worried about we're taking away the endowment fund, but that's really not the truth at all, that it will continue exactly as is with that particular part of the endowment fund. So the proposal here is we're going to propose three new, I'll call them three new endowment funds. The first one is called the building fund, and that's the one that I just talked about. It is the old endowment fund. All of the money that exists today will be transferred over to this building fund, and it will operate exactly the way that it does today. So that's $640,000. It will be moved to the building fund. And really, the only shift there is really talking about a shift in investment strategy, not in purpose. Then the other two, and I know this is a little bit hard to read, is the primary, the next one is the legacy fund. And this one, again, the two colored pieces here is this one will be another endowed fund so that we'll only spend the principal, but it also will be an unrestricted fund, right? The building fund, our existing endowment, is a restricted fund, meaning it has very specific purposes that we can spend the money on. The legacy fund will be unrestricted, and this will be a brand new endowment fund that will look to grow and expand. And its mission is broader than the building fund. It can be used to support building type missions, but it can also be to support different groups and committees throughout the church as well. And its goal is to be more of a long-term growth type fund, so we'll invest it accordingly. And then the third is called the Vision Fund. And it is very much like the Legacy Fund. It will be unrestricted. It doesn't have a specific intent, but it is not endowed. As we look to spend that, if someone donates to that fund, we'll be able to spend the entire principal. And the goal of these three funds and having three opportunities is really just try to align with the different donors and those wanting to give gifts. We were concerned that some donors may not feel passionate about giving to a building type fund. They'd rather see their gifts spent on missions or for kids activities or those types of things. So this is really all about building options to align with what a donor may want to do. So the building fund still provides what always has lived there. The legacy fund gives that same endowed principle. Sometimes that's important for donors. They want to see their gifts lived on and really just utilize the growth off of that. Then the Vision Fund offers offers an option for those. Like, I don't want this to be held on for forever. I want you guys to go spend it now. I want to see the results of that expenditure right now. So really, it's all about offering opportunities for those making gifts to the endowment fund. Okay, so there's two things as we talk about. We have the old endowment fund. We have these new options. So we're really trying to highlight what happens to all of those existing funds. And I kind of covered this one in the previous slide, but what happens to the existing endowment? Well, it 100% gets transferred over to the building fund. So again, trying to ease concerns about what's going to happen to it. But the old existing endowment fund gets transferred to the building fund and continues to operate as it does today. So the next, so what happens to our memorials, right? The endowment and memorials, we actually combined those two committees this year. So this group kind of manages both of them. So what happens to all of our existing memorials? And just the same thing that we talked about being concerned about preserving donor intent, we have to really follow those same ideas when we talk about the memorials. Some memorials were given with a very specific intent, and others weren't. They were open, they were unrestricted. So for the ones that were unrestricted, we'll start to migrate those into the Vision Fund, because that most closely aligns with what those donors wanted. It's in the memorial fund, so it hasn't ever been endowed, and it was unrestricted. Well, those are the same guidelines that the Vision Fund will hold. So if it was unrestricted, we'll migrate those into the Vision Fund. If it was restricted, we'll likely just leave those in the, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce that. Most of these memorial funds they live in checking accounts in the local banks. There's zero return being made off them. As we decide what we want to spend them on, they make zero return. So that's really the idea of moving them into a Vision Fund, that as we get organized and want to spend them or pool them together, as they move into a single fund, we can pool a number of $100 gifts together, and we can do something more impactful. Some of them had a very specific donor's intent. We will not move those into the Vision Fund, and we'll look to just spend those gifts as they come in out of the checking account, but obviously losing any sort of return that they could have came with. Usual. So a big shift here again, we're going to try to partner with KMF, the Kansas Methodist Foundation. And they offer a number of different benefits that excited us. The first one is they're going to be that investment vehicle, right? Just think of them like a broker of, like if you have an E-Trade account or whatever whatever your retirement is invested in. That's really the way that they operate. And again, they offer a number of different investment fund mixes that we can choose from, and we'll talk about the ones that we chose. But really being that investment vehicle that we'll utilize and allow us to migrate away from CDs. The next is an accounting and bookkeeping branch. I'm sorry, Joel. The next is an accounting and bookkeeping. Right now, we keep track of our own ledgers, and we have to go work with the banks and organize all of our CD returns, and then we provide them to the finance committee. We have traditionally been a little bit unconnected from the rest of the church's books, and through KMF, we want to try to bridge that gap and use their bookkeeping software and their techniques to really just tie right into our church's accounting, so that the endowment funds are really above, I don't want to say above board, they're really as visible as any of the rest of the church's finances. That makes it nice for the endowment committee, and I think it can allow us to get away from being more of an accounting arm and being more of an educational arm, so that we can organize things like estate planning, working with groups of how they want to organize to spend some of this money, and it gets us away from being bean counters, and again, moving into more ways to help grow these missions and support the spending of it as well. Part of another thing that the endowment, that the KMF will offer is they offer promotional material and guidance, so that as we look to make brochures and highlight what these different funds can do, they do that. They work with 800 different churches throughout the Kansas area, and they've done this type of stuff a lot. Dr. Petz has been extremely gracious with his time that he's devoted to Tonganoxie Methodist Church, that he's spent a lot of time helping us get organized and helping us write the charter that we're proposing. So they offer a lot of different experience and guidance to help us navigate and really just operate similar to the rest of many other churches who have a similar endowment. Okay, so this is the kind of introducing what investment mix that we're selecting from them. The Kansas Methodist Foundation offers a number of different funds that you can invest in, and the one that we are gravitating towards is called the Balanced Fund. It's really more geared for their long-term growth type investments. When I think about my retirement versus the church's endowment fund, I'm a younger fellow right now, so my retirement investments are fairly aggressive. And as I get older, they'll naturally start to tail off and get more into bonds and CD type investments, because as I get older, I can't withstand the dips and flows in the market, because I won't have time to get those to recover. Right now, it's pretty heavily invested in market-based investments, but as I get older, that'll shift. Contrast that with the endowment fund in the church. The church doesn't really ever retire. This fund exists for forever, right? And the goal here is to invest in more of these long-term type investments and be able, knowing that we have the time to withstand the ups and downs of a market swing, but really try to latch on to some of that more long-term growth that the more equity-based investments have. If we look at historically what the stock markets have done over the last 100 years, I even think I got a graph that I went back into the 1800s. And if you look at the growth of just really the NASDAQ type 500 type investments, they average roughly 10% over the long term. And compare that to some of our CD-based investments, there's a lot of opportunity for more growth there. We won't quite be invested in all just U.S.-based stocks. This talks about different funds that we'll invest in. We'll invest in 30% of domestic-based equities, so that's like stocks, 30% in international-based equities, so that's going to be just trying to help diversify ourselves so that we don't just fall down on when the U.S. market goes down, but we get to kind of ride them out and even out our diversification. Other pieces will be fixed income, so that's a lot like CDs or bonds and those type of things. So again, really trying to keep a more diversified mix with our investment strategy. Okay. Along with them being our investment broker or investment vehicle, comes with fees. This is a service that we will pay for. One thing that kind of excites us again with KMF is that it kind of takes away the human aspect of each individual person being on the endowment committee. We didn't want to have this idea of huge growth when you have a really good investor on the endowment committee and not very good growth when maybe somebody who's less familiar with investing is on the endowment committee. By handing the reins over to professionals, the idea is we get a better return and we get that consistency even regardless of who's on the committee. But again, that comes at a cost. These guys are a nonprofit organization, so they really would just pay for their salaries and keep their lights on, but this is a Kansas Methodist organization. Some of the things that goes into what we are paying for with the fees is obviously the investment and brokerage fees, right? That it costs money for them to make the investments and move money, so we have to pay for that. They also support grants to all those 800 churches that they support. They'll issue grants to the various churches, and we were actually a beneficiary of that here recently. They purchased some chairs for our classrooms downstairs, so they offer grants like that throughout the Kansas Methodist area. Again, I also talked about that promotional material that they'll help us produce, and then also their experience with education and guidance for how to navigate this type of universe. The fees that we're looking at, sorry, Hubie, I think I told you wrong. It's 0.75% of our whole investments is what the fees will be, which is much, much lower than I pay personally. I think normally I think of like a 2% investment fee type deal. So this is a relatively low investment fee. Okay, Charlie. Again, looking back to what are the changes we want to make to the endowment fund. We talked a lot about our investment strategy. Now we're moving into our intentional spending. And again, the idea of here is as people give, we want to make sure that we spend, and then we share that spending impact with them, and that encourages them to give more, and then we spend more, and then we share the story, and we affect and have a broader mission impact. That intentional spending, what we'd like to do is roughly the assumption that we're making is going to be roughly 7% growth. So what we want to do is spend 4% of that intentionally, and then reinvest 3% of that. And again, that keeps us ahead of the downward escalator of inflation, but it also gives the opportunity to really intentionally spend these gifts that people have given to the endowment. So I'm also on the Education Foundation for the Tonganoxie School District, and we do a very, very similar thing that as we collect donations throughout the school year, we offer grants to the teachers, and they may use it to buy new chairs or a new books or whatever project that they want to go support for their classroom that they can't get fulfilled through the school's budget. That's what the Education Foundation does. I envision a very, very similar thing through the endowment. As we work the various committees throughout the church, we'd like to offer various grants that they can use that would come out of this 4% intentional spending, and let those committees really drive what they want to go see happen in their specific area where they're passionate about. So another change that we're making, and again, I think Matthew handed out or has a copy of some of the new charter that's out there. We want to, as a part of this new charter, we want to set up a prohibition on borrowing from the endowed assets of the church. And want to be careful on language here, the difference between borrowing and lending. Borrowing would mean this idea of providing funds at zero rate return, right? Our duty as the endowment committee is to make sure that we're getting a return on the investments and these gifts that we're given. And as we give out, if we do borrowing without a rate of return, then we're not really staying true to that donor's intent. They wanted an endowed investment for their gift. And if we give it out with a zero rate of return, that's really not an investment. So really setting up inside of the charter, we've kind of said, that we will not do that. But there is a carve out for lending, right? But then it sets up the expectation that if we do lend from the endowment, then the rate of return would be similar to whatever a local bank would offer. Okay, and then a number of different just changes in miscellaneous bucket. I couldn't find a fancy slide to put them on. Just to quickly run through them. We're setting up an expectation or an assumption of what's going to happen to an undesignated fund that comes into the church that has no designation. And this happens from time to time. So we're kind of setting a cap out. If there's an unspecified donation for $5,000 or more, we're going to say we assume that that donor intended it to go to the legacy fund of the endowment. So if someone at the end of life event says, I'd like to give $10,000 to the United Methodist Church of Tonganoxie, but doesn't give any other guidance on it whatsoever, we will take that gift and we'll put it into the legacy fund and endow it, and then we'll spend it with that 4% spend that we talked about. Anything lower than 5% or $5,000, we'll just, that'll go into the church operating budget. We're also going to set up limits on what's called a donor-restricted fund. Think about the building fund that we talk about, the current legacy fund. That is a donor-restricted fund. The donor gave restrictions on what those funds can be spent on. It can only be spent on the building and the maintenance of the property. So we'd like to, we feel like there's a lot more freedom into these unrestricted funds, that they can shift and move with the changing of times, that those who are the ones that we're primarily going to promote the giving towards as these unrestricted funds, which can also be used to give to support the building. But these donor-restricted funds, there's costs associated with them, both administrative and just the maintenance of them. So we're going to set a cap of, if a new donor-restricted fund wants to be set up, we're going to put a cap on that as $100,000 or more. And again, that's thinking about that 4% expenditure rate out of that would only generate $4,000 a year with that $100,000 gift. So again, we're truly trying to maximize where these types of gifts go and how and what sort of costs we're setting up to manage them. If there's a gift that if somebody wants to give a lower gift than that, we'd really just encourage them to give to either the legacy fund or the vision fund, so that it doesn't have that restriction on it. And the last thing is really just talking about new endowment committee responsibilities. So if you have an interest in the endowment committee, listen up. So again, moving away from this accounting type role and moving more into an educational type role. So what we want to do is start to create and maintain various promotional material, and how do I give to the endowment fund? What is the impact of those gifts, and how do I organize with different committees on a way that they and ideas that they can spend that money? And again, another part of it is going to be communicating to that impact. And then also continue what we've always done, is done the managing of that fund distribution, right? As today, primarily working with the Board of Trustees to spend the building fund, which will continue, but also distributing the vision fund and the legacy fund type dollars. Okay, new picture that's really harder to see, I think. But again, we drew a picture of what it looked like before, and this is the picture of what it looks like after. This loses quite a bit when you can't see any of it. But on the left is, there's more people there, and that's intentional, right? The goal of all of this communication is going to be growing the donor list and those wanting to contribute to the endowment fund. In the middle, we have the blue and the green bubbles, similar blue bubbles, but two new endowed assets, right? We have the legacy fund, and then we have the building fund. So those are just two new investment pools that will be inside those endowed assets. We have a new green bubble down there. That's the non-endowed assets. That's the vision fund, right? So that's where it will be held. Beyond that, very similar outflow, right? As we pull funds out of this, they'll go into a checking account, and that's how we'll distribute it to the various groups. But again, on the right, much more groups, many more groups than just the trustees, right? Our goal is to impact all the various committees here at the church. We want to support missions, whatever special projects that we may have, and again, also to continue to support the Board of Trustees as well. I think that might be it, Charlie. Boy, Matthew, I'm way early. What questions do you guys have?
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
Comments have come up about compliance, state law. Have we been out of compliance?
Yeah, so the question is, comments have been raised about, are we out of compliance with the new state laws? And I think it's a gray area. What these new state laws intended to do is they want to encourage endowments like what we have here at Tonganoxie Methodist Church. They view that as a healthy thing to help support churches and local entities. So they want to see endowments be created. They want to see endowments be maintained. And what these new laws really encourage is diversification in their investments. They want to see investment choices that help offset the rising cost of inflation. I'm blanking on the name of that law. Yeah, so it's the law is the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. That's a mouthful. I'll just read it quickly. Kansas law now encourages foundations to act in ways to protect their funds and grow them with diversified investment portfolios, provide a standard of conduct in managing and investing institutional fund. The Kansas Methodist Foundation, who is our partner, they help us. We kind of connect with them, and they help make sure that we're following those guidelines. I think the concern of what that law is trying to do is really make sure that we don't continue to be too conservatively based invested and kind of get gobbled up by the inflation. Here's a specific sentence from that law. An institution shall diversify the investments of an institutional fund unless the institution reasonably determines that because of special circumstances, the purposes of the fund are better served without diversification. So again, really trying to push that diversification. And with the balanced fund that we're looking to partner with KMF with, that offers a much, much larger degree of diversification. Thank you, Matthew. Good question. Any other questions?
So I assume the CDs are maturing at different periods and they will be laddered into this investment over time?
Yeah, and so the question was, what happens to the CDs? Do they have a staggered maturity period? And the answer is yes. Yeah, so throughout time, we've invested in a CD, and a year later, we invest in another CD, and a year later. So they all kind of have various staggered maturity dates. We've actually already started a little bit of this process so that as some have matured, we've migrated some into the Kansas Methodist Foundation. We kind of hit a limit on that. Our previous charter's guidelines for invested really capped us at that equity-based investments at 20% of our total pool investments. And this shift is going to move us more into the 60% range of equity-based investments. So we moved enough over into KMF to start to get some of this benefit of the return. 2022 didn't really help us with that very much. But what some of this, the vote on the charter will help allow us to do is to migrate more over there that we will then extend beyond the 20% limit that they had set up in 1989. Any other questions?
So you talked about like the ebbs and flows of investing, and what we're talking about is more of a long-term investor, but as a church, we need to actively spend that money. So we're really acting as someone who's already retired. So how are we going to deal with the ebbs and flows?
So the question is, how are we going to deal with the ebbs and flows of the market, because we're already actually spending some of it, just like as you pull out of your retirement fund. So good question. So we have an existing emergency fund, right? So that will continue to exist, and the idea is we'll refund portions of that emergency fund through the growth of the investment. I think I would challenge that in the opposite way, that as we look today, we make approximately 2%, and we are spending at a rate that is much higher than our growth is, and that's concerning. And the idea here is to change investment, ideally to get additional growth, and pull that 4% out instead of the 2% that we're getting today. So ideally, with these investment strategies, we have more growth, but also on the other end is to educate, encourage, and promote the giving into these endowments funds, is to grow that principle more, so it will grow more. So trying to attack it on both ends as well.
Could you maybe speak to how the 4%
Oh, good idea. Yeah, so I think I skipped over this in the slide that talked about our intentional spending. So so the idea of this 4% spending, it'll be 4% of a rolling 3-year average, right? So years like 2022, where most of the things are down, that'll be averaged out with other years that ideally have done better, and years that do very, very well will also average those down to save for down years. A good example that Dr. Petz used was maybe one of the things we'd like to do with these grant type things is offer a scholarship. And with this 3-year rolling average that we'll spend the 4% from, on an up year, the kids get a scholarship and they love it. But on a down year, we say, I'm sorry, you should have graduated a different year, no scholarship for you. So with the 3-year rolling average, the idea is that we kind of even out the troughs and the peaks in the market. Thank you. Good questions. All right, thank you guys. I apologize for how small the slides were. We can send out those slides to anybody who's interested so you can dive into it. And there's also a lot of different material that we have available if you'd like some not very light reading. Maybe, Matthew, if you could maybe talk about the vote that's coming up to make sure that everybody's aware of those deadlines.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I do public speaking. I just can't not, so I'm up here. But I first just want to thank Mark for all of his time on this. Can we thank Mark for just all the work that takes to put into this? Also, Joel Skelly worked very closely with him, and also David Higbee is the chair of the Endowment Committee, and he really gave us permission to start this work throughout the whole year, so thank you as well, David. So next Sunday, I'm going to give this announcement again in a few minutes, but next Sunday is our Charge Conference, and we're intentionally hosting it between our 2 worship services to also raise awareness of how the governance of our church works, which is that the power is in your hands as the congregation. It's not in my hands or in one person's hands. And so our church council will make some voting on leadership for next year, a budget, that kind of general business. But at the end of that, our district superintendent will be here to oversee an all-church vote, and that's what these town halls were preparing us for, is to hold a vote by show of hands to either reject or accept this new set of bylaws for the endowment program, which would allow the change in the investment philosophy and change it from a 20% cap on equities to be able to increase that. Well, it doesn't really have a cap in the new charter, just encourage diversification. But that vote, it's intended to be as many people as possible. Any member of the church can come and vote in that, and so that would unlock the doors for the endowment committee to go and create these 3 new funds, to start really focusing on receiving new gifts and to try to increase our growth for the trustees and then eventually all the other ministries of the church. So that's the vision of why we're doing this. And so next Sunday, 10 o'clock, so right after the 9 o'clock service, just come in here. It'll be about 20 minutes probably, and we'll just do the voting. And so yeah, any questions about that process? All right. Well, we're right on time, 9:45. How about that? Mark, thank you so much again, and thank you all for taking the time to come out this morning.
Thank you, guys.